Standing in the name of Ms. Gazan.
Ms. Gazan, seconded by Ms. Collins, and I confirm that they're both online, that Bill C-232, an act respecting a climate emergency action framework, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Environment and Sustainable Development. Debate, the Honourable Member for Winnipeg Centre. Ms. Gazan, I think your mic just needs to be activated there. There you are. Good. Okay, carry on.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just like to share how honored I am to be here with all of you today to share my first private member's bill as a member of Parliament. It is a very exciting day for sure. Close to 50 years ago, in 1972, the first international meeting on the environment took place where member states adopted the Stockholm Declaration, which affirmed our responsibility to protect the environment for future generations. 2020, we have failed. We have failed in upholding this commitment, and we now find ourselves in a climate crisis combined with a human rights crisis in our failure to recognize a clean, healthy, and safe environment as a human right. Something that has been recognized by 156 out of 193 member states. Canada is far behind in the world in taking bold actions against the climate emergency. And this climate emergency is threatening everything we know, everything we value. Wildfires, flooding, extreme weather is worsening. The futures of our children and grandchildren's lives are on the line. All life is now on the line, and everything depends now on the actions that we take. In fact, the Canadian Pediatric Society indicates for children that children are among the most vulnerable to the health impacts of the climate crisis. Young people also report frequent experiences with anxiety related to their fears around the climate emergency. And the reality is that anxiety is based in fact because we are running out of time to turn things around. In fact, Canada has not met a single climate target it has set. Not a single climate target. And young people, Indigenous peoples, and civil society groups want action and accountability from our government. The impacts of the climate crisis are already being felt in Canada, particularly in the Arctic and along the coast, disproportionately impacting Indigenous nations, rural communities, and communities composed of members from marginalized and racialized groups. In fact, the climate emergency has significantly impacted and destroyed the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, in turn impacting livelihood. And this was in fact noted by the current UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, as released in a report outlining how the lack of legal right to a healthy environment has a direct impact on Indigenous peoples and racialized communities in Canada. And we are witnessing around the country that individuals, Indigenous nations, and young people want action, real action, to address the climate crisis. And I know our party, The New Democratic Party share this concern and honor that this cannot be achieved without the recognition and respect of the fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples, as affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And Canada's nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples must be respected. There is no reconciliation in the absence of justice, and this bill will be a step forward towards climate justice and upholding human rights, particularly with Indigenous people, something that the current Prime Minister indicated was the most important relationship. People are tired of words. We are faced with the biggest existential threat, and yet we have a government who continues to fail to act, continues to willfully violate the human rights of Indigenous peoples on their own watch. There is no reconciliation in the absence of justice, and that also includes climate justice. Moreover, Indigenous women are experiencing the most direct impacts of the climate emergency. Their interests must be specifically considered under Article 22 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which states, particular attention, in quotes, particular attention shall be paid to the rights and the special needs of Indigenous elders, women, youth, children, and persons with disabilities in the implementation of the Declaration. It also states, states shall take measures in conjunction with Indigenous people to ensure that Indigenous women, children, and children enjoy the full protection, and guarantees against all forms of violence and discrimination. I think it's important to note that in the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, they found actually, in fact, a direct correlation that exists between an influx of transient workers, those who arrive mostly in isolated towns and cities from elsewhere to work in mines or industries like oil and gas and hydro, and higher rates of sexual assault, harassment, STIs, and human trafficking. A right to a healthy environment and human rights of women and girls is always interconnected. We are sisters. We are mothers. We are aunties, and we are grandmothers, and our bodies and our lives are sacred. Sacred like our Mother Earth, whose life she provides needs to be honored, just like our women, our girls, our sisters, and our aunties, and our grandmothers who continue to face unimaginable violence for the purposes of economic gain. We are sacred beings. And in addition to women, girls, and transgendered, Indigenous peoples are among the most impacted by the climate emergency, including disrupting traditional ways of life and food security, especially in the north, which is warming up at a much faster rate. And this has given a rise to costs for imported food alternatives, leaving individuals with only being able to afford unhealthy food options, contributing to greater food insecurity and negative impacts on health. Indigenous people in Canada are among the lowest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions in the country, yet research indicates they are the most impacted by the climate crisis. Indigenous peoples have experienced the impacts of the climate crisis for generations and are most often the ones on the front lines fighting to protect our Mother Earth. I have joined them on those front lines. We must respect Indigenous science and knowledge that provides a complex understanding about how to address the climate crisis, which is why it informs the development framework of Bill C-232. Yesterday, I was really happy to see the government introduce Bill C-15, an act respecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is why I am so pleased, especially to rise today, to present my PMB, Bill C-232, the Climate Action Emergency Framework. The first test of this government's commitment to uphold the human rights articulated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Bill C-15 requires that all new legislation from this House be consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and I am very proud to say that Bill C-232 is consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. A bill that supports the development of a made-in-Canada Green New Deal that ensures that Canada takes all measures necessary to respect its commitments under the Convention on Climate Change to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that it does so while fully complying with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have international commitments as well to fight other international commitments as well to fight the climate emergency and uphold human rights. And this includes the UN Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I can't say that too many times. This bill upholds these international agreements and recognizes the right of all Canadians to a safe, clean, healthy environment as a human right. And there is widespread consensus that human rights norms apply to environmental issues, including the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And in fact, more than 100 countries in the world have recognized this human right in their legislation or constitution, and it's time for Canada to follow their lead. The Parliament of Canada has recognized that we are in a climate emergency. So the fact that this government fails to appropriately react and continues to put forth plans that will not allow us to meet climate targets needs to end. Bill C-232 calls on the Government of Canada to take all measures necessary to mitigate the impacts of the climate emergency and provides a framework to achieve a made-in-Canada Green New Deal with accountability and transparency measures to hold the government to account. This framework would save lives and mitigate the impacts of the climate emergency on public health, the natural environment, and on the economy while upholding, lifting up human rights. If the government is serious about Bill C-15, and I do hope they are, supporting this bill would be an act of good faith and a first attempt by this government to demonstrate that it is serious in its commitment to adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It is time we begin divesting from fossil fuels and reinvesting in a green economy that brings workers along, increases employment in the green energy sector, increases investment in green infrastructure and housing in respect of human rights. Bill C-232 provides a critical framework for this transformation to achieve a transformative climate action legislation. We are running out of time. We must act now. Our ability to survive depends on what we do now. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we talk about the importance of climate action as an issue, indigenous